Charles had weathered scandal, survived years of public scrutiny, and carried the weight of the crown through every storm the tabloids could throw at him. But nothing had prepared him for the moment his own sister placed Meghan's secret plan directly in front of William, in his own study, with no warning and no way to look away. The king's composure did not bend, it shattered. What had begun as a quiet afternoon briefing turned, in the space of a single sentence, into the most painful confrontation the family had faced in years. Before we go any further into what this truly means for the monarchy, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an update the moment it breaks. Charles understood almost instantly why the room had gone silent. Anne had not walked in to discuss scheduling or public appearances. She had walked in holding a folder that contained something far heavier. A private outline, drafted on Meghan's behalf, describing a path back into royal life that nobody in the family had approved and nobody had been consulted on. Anne did not soften the moment. She placed the folder on the desk, opened it to the first marked page, and waited for her brother to read it in silence. The plan itself was not a simple wish to reconnect. It described a structured route toward visibility, coordinated appearances at select royal events, quiet access to family gatherings, and language suggesting a future where Meghan would stand beside senior royals without ever formally rejoining the working family. A working royal role, simply put, means an official position within the monarchy that comes with public duties, protocols, and accountability to the crown. Anne wanted Charles to understand that what was being proposed sat somewhere in between: presence without responsibility, visibility without oversight. Charles read the first page carefully, then the second. When he reached the section referencing his grandchildren, something in his expression changed. William, standing near the window, saw it before either Charles or Anne said another word. He had watched his father absorb criticism from the press, endure years of speculation about his health, and hold his composure through moments that would have broken most people. But this was different. This was not politics. This was family, and family was the one place Charles had never learned how to protect himself. Anne did not raise her voice, but she did not retreat either. She explained, calmly and without hesitation, that the plan blurred a line that had taken years to rebuild. If Meghan were permitted even limited visibility at major royal occasions without any accompanying responsibility, it would not remain an isolated exception. It would become a precedent, and precedents, once set, are almost impossible to undo. Charles set his glasses down on the desk and said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that William finally stepped closer, unsure whether his father was searching for a rebuttal or simply trying to hold himself together. William had not yet spoken his own opinion, but his face told a different story. He had seen something buried in the language of the proposal that unsettled him even more than his aunt's confrontation. It was not simply about Meghan wanting to be present. It was about the quiet, careful wording suggesting that presence could exist without the usual boundaries the monarchy had always required. And as Charles struggled with the emotional weight of the moment, William was about to reveal exactly why that distinction frightened him. The room had stopped feeling like a family conversation. It had become something closer to a negotiation over what the crown itself was willing to become. Charles saw a broken relationship he still believed could be repaired. Anne saw an opening that, left unchecked, could quietly reshape the boundaries of the institution she had spent her whole life protecting. William saw something even more dangerous. An old conflict returning in a new, quieter form, one that would force every person in that room to decide where compassion ended and responsibility began. Charles kept circling back to the same unbearable point. Harry was still his son. The children were still his grandchildren, regardless of how far the distance between them had grown. That single truth made it almost impossible for him to separate judgment from longing. A working royal role carries obligations that extend far beyond a single family reunion, and Charles understood, even through his grief, that granting even a fraction of that standing again would ripple far past his own household. Anne remained resolute because she believed the proposal was designed to exploit exactly that hesitation. She pointed to specific phrasing buried inside the accompanying correspondence, language suggesting that participation was being requested without any of the usual restrictions placed on working members of the family. She read the lines slowly, then looked directly at her brother. To her, the issue was never really about whether Meghan wanted to be present. It was about whether she wanted the visibility that came with royal life while remaining free from the accountability that visibility always demanded. Charles finally admitted, in a voice heavier than anger, what had been driving his hesitation from the very beginning. Rejecting the plan outright, he said, risked pushing Harry even further away and making contact with the children harder than it already was. The words carried more sorrow than defiance. Anne heard it, but she did not step back, because she understood something her brother, in that moment, could not fully see. Guilt has a way of turning a temporary emotional decision into a permanent institutional one. William chose his next words with care, aware that whatever he said would land heavily on his father. He told Charles that reconciliation could not be built on granting Meghan a role that existed somewhere between family member and working royal. He could accept private, unrestricted family contact without hesitation. What worried him was a structure where one branch of the family operated under palace rules while another operated independently, drawing attention without carrying the same responsibilities. Two competing versions of royal life, he warned, would confuse the public and deepen tensions that were already difficult to contain. William moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the handle, and turned back. "This cannot be decided out of guilt," he said quietly. Charles did not respond immediately, but the sentence settled over the room like a weight nobody could lift. William then explained why he had arrived at that conclusion so firmly. Through a separate, documented exchange passed along by royal aides weeks earlier, he had already seen early signs of exactly this kind of request. Small at first, easy to dismiss, but part of a pattern that had been building quietly for months. That earlier exchange had seemed almost harmless when it first appeared. A request for a private, low-key appearance at a family gathering. Nothing formal, nothing official. Simply a hope that old wounds might soften without drawing public attention. Charles had welcomed the gesture at the time, believing that any small step toward healing was worth the risk. Anne had been far more cautious. She noted how carefully the request avoided any mention of official duties, while still asking for visible placement beside senior family members. A subtle but important distinction that Charles, caught up in his hope for reconciliation, had not fully registered. Anne kept a copy of that earlier correspondence and quietly asked that William be briefed, not to create conflict, but because she believed the future king needed to understand how easily private healing could begin overlapping with public royal standing. William read those same lines months later and instantly understood why his aunt had stopped treating the situation as a simple family matter. When the larger, more detailed proposal arrived, Anne placed the two documents side by side and saw the pattern immediately. The earlier request had not been an isolated moment. It had been the first quiet test of how far the family might be willing to bend. With both documents now open on the desk, Anne was no longer willing to wait and observe. The confrontation Charles had been avoiding for weeks could no longer be postponed. She did not raise her voice, because she did not need to. Her point landed with the quiet certainty of someone who believed the evidence already spoke for itself. Charles tried, more than once, to defend the possibility of a middle ground, some version of compromise that could satisfy everyone. But every attempt pulled the conversation deeper into old grief, unresolved guilt, and the fragile hope of one day being close to his grandchildren again. Then Anne asked the one question that stripped away every remaining layer of royal formality and left her brother with nowhere left to hide. She asked whether he was truly prepared to say no, even if that meant risking even less contact with Harry's children in the years ahead. Charles pressed his fingers against his eyes. He pushed his chair back slightly and looked away from both of them. The silence that followed was heavier than anything spoken before it. Anne's expression softened, but she did not withdraw the question. William finally broke the quiet himself. Through a separate note passed to him earlier that week, he had learned that Harry expected any real step toward reconciliation to include some visible acknowledgement of Meghan's place within the wider family. William explained that the situation was no longer just about private contact. Public recognition, even limited, could easily be interpreted as the beginning of a broader return to influence, especially if it came without the same responsibilities expected of working royals. Anne seized on that distinction immediately. She told Charles that the real question was no longer whether Meghan physically returned to royal life. It was whether she could gain the visibility of that life while remaining outside the accountability that came with it. That possibility, she argued, could create something far more dangerous than reconciliation. A position with all the recognition of royal standing, but none of its limits. Charles slowly turned back toward the desk. His face carried exhaustion now, not anger. He looked at Anne, then at the folder, and finally at William. "If this were entirely your decision," he asked quietly, "what would you do?" The room reached its emotional breaking point in that instant. The next answer would determine whether Charles's grief shaped the outcome, or whether William would draw a line his father could not bring himself to draw alone. William understood exactly what his father was really asking. This was not simply a question about Meghan. It was a test of whether the future king would place emotional peace above institutional boundaries, or whether he would accept one painful decision now to prevent years of confusion later. He looked between his father and his aunt and gave an answer that shifted the entire conversation from an emotional dispute into a question of structure and control. William explained, slowly and deliberately, that the monarch could always influence private family access. Invitations to family gatherings, quiet visits, personal contact, all of that remained within Charles's control as a father. But working royal status depended on defined duties, public accountability, and responsibility to the crown. And those two things could never be allowed to blur, simply because emotion made the separation uncomfortable. Charles listened without interrupting, but the steadiness in his son's voice unsettled him. He wanted Harry back, not because he had forgotten the pain of the last several years, but because that distance had already cost the family more than he could bear to lose further. William understood that pain completely. Still, he refused to accept public visibility as the price of private healing. To him, reconciliation built on official recognition would never be real reconciliation. It would only be a transaction dressed up as forgiveness. Anne backed him without hesitation. She warned that informal exceptions rarely stay informal once the public has witnessed them. One visible appearance creates an expectation for another, and once those expectations take root, reversing them looks less like a boundary and more like punishment. A precedent, she reminded them, is simply an earlier decision used later to justify something similar, and that was precisely the risk buried inside the proposal sitting on the desk. William then offered the clearest resolution the room had heard all afternoon. His father could pursue reconciliation with Harry, Meghan, and the children as freely and as often as he wished. But that reconciliation would never create an automatic path back to official duties, ceremonial placement, or any semi-formal royal role. He slid the folder gently away from Charles. A family invitation, he said, must never be allowed to become a constitutional negotiation. Charles felt those words more deeply than he expected. For a brief moment he wondered whether his son had grown too guarded, too shaped by years of public scrutiny to see the situation with any warmth left in it. But William did not sound cold. He sounded resolved, someone drawing a boundary not against his family, but against allowing personal pain to become leverage over an institution he would one day be responsible for protecting. Anne added one final condition. From that point forward, every future request needed to be clearly labeled as either personal or connected to the crown, with no blurred language and no emotional bridge built between the two. Charles gave no immediate answer. He simply looked at the folder now resting at the edge of the desk and said nothing for a long moment. Deciding on a boundary privately was one thing. Enforcing it in public would carry consequences far beyond that room, and those consequences began almost immediately. Once the palace prepared its formal response, the mood shifted instantly. What had briefly looked like a bridge toward reconciliation was now being divided into two distinct paths, one personal, one institutional. On paper, the distinction seemed simple enough. In practice, it threatened expectations that had quietly been building for months. When the message finally reached Harry and Meghan, Their reaction revealed just how differently each side had understood the entire conversation from the start. Charles approved language that kept private family contact open while firmly rejecting any automatic return to official duties or guaranteed ceremonial presence. William and Anne stood behind the decision and insisted that any future invitation be evaluated individually, rather than treated as part of a standing arrangement, a continuing agreement that would apply automatically rather than being reconsidered each time. That distinction mattered enormously because a single permanent exception could quietly harden into an expectation no one had the ability to walk back later. Charles felt regret settle in almost as soon as the response left his hands. He worried that Harry would interpret the boundary not as protection of the monarchy, but as another rejection from a father who had already disappointed him more than once. The king had hoped to preserve a quiet path back to his family. Instead, he understood exactly how easily even the most carefully worded compromise could be mistaken for another wound. Meghan received the message very differently. Through the written response returned to the Sussex household, she focused on what she viewed as an uneven offer, family access without any meaningful public recognition attached to it. Harry tried to defend her frustration, but the wording of the letter unsettled him more than he expected. He could also see that his father had deliberately left the personal door open, which made it far harder to dismiss the entire response as an outright refusal. Then a second message arrived. Charles read it once, then again, more slowly. The Sussex side asked directly whether the grandchildren would be treated differently from their parents at future royal occasions. That single question landed exactly where Anne had warned it eventually would. If Harry and Meghan remained outside official royal life, what would that mean for the children whenever ceremonies, gatherings, and public appearances inevitably overlapped? William immediately understood why his father fell silent after reading it. Anne had insisted that family and institution remain separate, but the presence of the grandchildren made that separation far harder to sustain in practice. Charles folded the message once, placed it inside a drawer, and left his hand resting there for several long seconds before making a different choice entirely. He asked every aide in the room to step outside, leaving only William behind. He did not want another carefully drafted statement. He did not want another filtered exchange managed through advisors. This question had become far too personal for formal procedure. With the doors closed and no one else listening, Charles and William were no longer simply monarch and heir. They were a father and son facing a decision that no title could soften. Charles had spent the entire confrontation defending the idea of compromise, but now, with no audience left to consider, he finally admitted what had truly been driving him from the very beginning. He told William that public embarrassment had never been what frightened him. He could withstand headlines, criticism, and another wave of public frustration without much difficulty. What terrified him was the possibility of losing more years with Harry's children, years that could never be recovered once they were gone. William understood that fear completely, because personal relationships and royal structures were never meant to operate under the same rules. One could heal without automatically reshaping the other. Charles then admitted something even harder to say aloud. Guilt, he confessed, had repeatedly pushed him toward concessions he would have rejected instantly if the same requests had come from anyone else. He had convinced himself that flexibility might eventually bring Harry closer. Instead, every small compromise had only made the next decision more difficult to hold firm on. In that quiet moment, the king finally understood why Anne had confronted him so directly earlier that day. She had seen his love for his family slowly beginning to shape decisions that would outlast the emotion of any single afternoon. William did not respond with pride or satisfaction. He spoke instead about his own sense of loss. He admitted that he still missed the brother he once trusted completely, and that refusing to recreate the old working relationship did nothing to erase that sadness. He had no interest in turning reconciliation into punishment. He simply believed private forgiveness had to remain private, because public royal standing carried responsibilities that could never be switched on and off, depending on the emotional temperature of the moment. William offered one final, gentler compromise. His father was free to pursue reconciliation with Harry, Meghan, and the children in any way he wished, without restriction from him. But no personal breakthrough would ever create an automatic path back into official royal life. Charles listened closely, and for the first time that entire day, the distinction no longer felt like rejection. It felt like protection. Charles reached across the desk and briefly took his son's hand. "Being a father and being king have never felt further apart," he said quietly. William did not respond right away, because both of them understood exactly what had just shifted between them. Charles finally accepted that Anne's confrontation earlier that day had never been an attempt to punish Meghan. It had been an attempt to stop his own grief from quietly becoming permanent royal precedent. The private decision was made. What remained was learning how the family would survive the moment it inevitably became public. By the following morning, what had unfolded quietly behind closed doors had already become a national story. The public never saw the silences, the folded letters, or the private conversation between Charles and William. They saw a far simpler headline. Anne had challenged Meghan's proposed return, and the king had agreed to draw a firmer line between family reconciliation and royal authority. One moment outside the palace gates captured the public mood better than any official statement could. Charles watched as the palace framed the decision as a clarification, rather than a punishment, insisting that private family relationships would never automatically restore formal royal responsibilities. That distinction mattered because it left room for the family to continue healing quietly, without reopening questions about status, duty, or ceremonial authority. William felt some relief that the boundary had finally been made clear, but he also understood exactly what it cost. Commentators split almost immediately over whether the decision reflected discipline, unnecessary rigidity, or simply a realistic response after years of unresolved tension. William knew his role in the decision would be examined closely, and that some would portray him as the primary force keeping Meghan outside official royal duties. He accepted that risk, even though it did not make the criticism any easier to sit with. Charles struggled more visibly with the coverage than his son did. He watched one broadcast reduce the entire ordeal to a simple contest of winners and losers, as though his fear of losing more time with his grandchildren had never existed at all. Midway through the segment, he switched the television off and sat in silence for several long moments, frustrated that the most painful part of the decision had become completely invisible to everyone watching from the outside. Anne's role in the confrontation quickly became impossible to ignore. One commentator, referencing details of the private meeting that had since become public knowledge, described her as the family member willing to force a conversation Charles had been too emotionally overwhelmed to face on his own. She never responded publicly, but the narrative had already reshaped her quiet intervention into the defining moment of the entire dispute. Outside the palace gates, the public reaction grew impossible to overlook. Small crowds gathered near the entrance, camera crews broadcast live coverage throughout the day, and one newspaper stand displayed a headline that captured the divide in just a few words. Family welcomed, royal return denied. Some viewed it as strength. Others saw only rejection. Either way, the message had escaped the privacy of the palace and taken on a momentum entirely its own. Charles turned away from the noise outside and returned to the private note concerning his grandchildren, the one question that mattered more to him than any headline ever could. The public had already decided who had won and who had lost. He, however, was left to determine what the day truly meant once there was no longer an audience left to perform for. In the end, Anne's confrontation did not break Charles. It forced him to finally separate two truths he had been desperately trying to hold together for months. He could still love Harry without condition. He could still hope, quietly and patiently, to know his grandchildren. He could even leave space for Meghan within the private boundaries of family life. None of that, however, required him to surrender the principles that governed the institution itself. Accepting that difference is what finally brought the king back from the emotional edge he had been standing on all day. Charles confirmed the final position with far more calm than he had shown at the start of the conversation. Private reconciliation with Harry, Meghan, and the children would always remain possible. But there would be no automatic restoration of official duties, no privileged ceremonial standing, and no independent royal authority granted without the responsibilities that had always come attached to it. William accepted the decision because it created a boundary strong enough to outlast the emotion of one exhausting afternoon. Anne saw something equally meaningful in it. Compassion and discipline, she realized, did not have to destroy each other. She had pushed her brother as hard as she did because she believed protecting the monarchy also meant protecting Charles from making a permanent decision while buried in guilt. Charles still felt the full weight of everything that had been lost. One conversation had not repaired the distance with Harry, and nothing about the final decision erased the pain surrounding his grandchildren. But that sadness no longer controlled his judgment. For the first time in months, he could acknowledge the loss honestly, without allowing the fear of losing even more to shape every decision that followed. Later that evening, Anne spoke with her brother privately, away from advisors and formal settings. She told him that confronting him earlier had been one of the hardest things she had done, precisely because she understood how deeply he wanted his family whole again. Charles finally saw her intervention for what it truly was. What had initially felt like resistance had actually stopped a temporary emotional decision from quietly becoming a permanent institutional precedent. William understood the lesson just as clearly. One day, the full responsibility of protecting the monarchy would rest entirely on him, and this single afternoon had shown exactly what that responsibility could demand. Sometimes protecting a relationship means refusing to let it become a tool of influence or leverage, no matter how much love remains underneath it. Charles signed the final response, paused briefly over the page, and set the pen down. He looked at both Anne and William and told them the family door would always remain open. But the line separating personal love from institutional responsibility would stay exactly where it needed to be. With that distinction finally settled, the crisis that had brought the king to tears reached its quiet, difficult end. Anne had forced the conversation no one else was willing to start. William had defended the future the monarchy would one day depend on. And Charles, through all the grief and hesitation, had finally discovered that real reconciliation never requires surrender. In the days that followed, the palace tried to return to something resembling normal rhythm, but nothing about the atmosphere felt ordinary. Staff who had worked alongside Charles for years noticed the change immediately. He arrived earlier than usual, stayed later than necessary, and spent long stretches of the afternoon standing near the window of his study, rather than seated at his desk. Nobody asked him directly what had happened behind those closed doors. They did not need to. The tension in the building spoke for itself. Anne, for her part, carried on with her schedule as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. She attended her engagements, signed her correspondence, and offered no visible sign of the confrontation that had shaken her brother so deeply. Privately, however, she replayed the conversation more than once, wondering whether she had pushed too hard or not hard enough. She had spent her entire life believing that duty came before comfort, but watching Charles struggle so visibly with the decision reminded her that duty rarely arrives without a cost attached to it. William, meanwhile, found himself thinking less about the headlines and more about his own children. He wondered what kind of family structure they would inherit one day, and whether the boundaries he had insisted upon that afternoon would still make sense a generation from now. He did not regret the position he had taken. If anything, the experience clarified something he had suspected for years, that protecting the monarchy sometimes meant disappointing the people he loved most, and that the willingness to accept that discomfort was, in many ways, the truest measure of readiness for the role waiting for him. A week after the initial confrontation, a quiet request arrived from Harry, delivered through the usual channels rather than directly. He asked for a short, private call with his father. Nothing formal, no aides listening in. Simply a conversation between two people who had spent years talking past each other rather than to each other. Charles agreed almost immediately, relieved that his son had not shut the door entirely despite everything. The call, when it finally happened, lasted longer than either of them expected. Harry spoke about the frustration of watching his family reduced to headlines and hot takes, about the exhaustion of having every gesture interpreted as strategy rather than sincerity. Charles listened without interrupting, something he had not always managed successfully in the past. When Harry finally asked whether there was any real path forward, Charles gave him the same honest answer he had given Anne and William days earlier. Private reconciliation would always be welcome. Public recognition without responsibility would not. Harry did not respond with anger. If anything, his voice softened, as though some part of him had expected that answer and simply needed to hear it stated plainly, rather than filtered through advisors and carefully worded statements. He admitted that Meghan's proposal had grown out of frustration more than calculation, a response to feeling perpetually on the outside looking in every conversation. And he acknowledged, if his own quiet way, that some of the language in the plan had gone further than he had originally intended. That admission did not resolve everything, but it shifted the tone of the relationship in a way that Charles had not felt in years. For the first time since the earlier estrangement, father and son were speaking honestly rather than negotiating through intermediaries. Charles hung up the phone that evening and sat quietly for a long while, feeling something closer to hope than he had allowed himself in a long time. Meghan's reaction, when she eventually learned the full details of the exchange between Harry and his father, was more complicated. She understood the boundary being drawn, but she still felt the sting of exclusion that came with it. Harry tried to explain that the boundary was not personal, that it reflected an institutional reality neither of them could easily change. But the explanation did little to soften the disappointment. Still, she did not push the issue further, recognizing that continued pressure risked undoing the fragile progress that had just been made. Back at the palace, Anne and William began working quietly to establish clearer guidelines for how future requests from the Sussex household would be handled going forward. They agreed that any communication touching on official duties, ceremonial placement, or public representation would be reviewed jointly rather than left to Charles alone, a small but meaningful safeguard against the possibility of guilt-clouding judgment during future negotiations. Charles accepted the arrangement without resistance, recognizing it not as a lack of trust in him, but as a structure designed to protect the family from repeating the same painful cycle. Months later, when royal watchers looked back on the episode, opinions remained divided, much as they had been in the days immediately following the confrontation. Some continued to frame it as proof of institutional rigidity, an unwillingness to bend even slightly toward reconciliation. Others viewed it as a necessary correction, a moment where the family finally drew a line that protected both its future and its remaining relationships from being reshaped by grief and guilt. What almost nobody outside the immediate family fully understood was how much the confrontation had changed the internal dynamics among Charles, Anne, and William. The three of them spoke more openly after that day than they had in years, no longer relying solely on formal briefings and carefully managed schedules to communicate. Difficult conversations, once avoided out of politeness or fear of upsetting one another, became slightly easier to have, precisely because the hardest one had already happened, and the family had survived it. Charles occasionally revisited that afternoon in quiet moments, replaying the sequence of events in his mind. He remembered the folder Anne had placed in front of him, the silence that followed, and the exhaustion that had settled over him by the time William finally spoke the words that shifted everything. He understood now that his sister's confrontation, as painful as it had been in the moment, had ultimately protected him from a decision he would have deeply regretted. It had not felt like protection at the time. It had felt like betrayal, like his own family turning against the one thing he wanted most. But time and reflection had reshaped that memory into something closer to gratitude. Anne never sought credit for what she had done that day, and she rarely spoke about it publicly, even when journalists occasionally referenced the episode in profiles written about her decades of steady, unglamorous service to the crown. She continued doing what she had always done, showing up, doing the work, and letting the institution speak for itself, rather than seeking personal recognition for the difficult choices she had made along the way. William, for his part, carried the lesson forward into his own approach to leadership. He understood now, more clearly than before, that the hardest decisions a future monarch would face were rarely about grand policy or sweeping reform. They were about smaller, more painful choices, the kind that pitted love against duty and forced a person to choose which one would ultimately guide their judgment. He had chosen duty that afternoon, not because he loved his family any less, but because he understood that protecting the institution was, in its own complicated way, a form of protecting the people within it. As for the wider public, the story eventually faded from the front pages, replaced by newer headlines and fresher controversies, as royal stories often are. But within the family itself, the events of that single afternoon remained a quiet turning point, a moment when love, guilt, duty, and responsibility had collided in a single room and forced three people to decide, together, what kind of family and what kind of monarchy they wanted to protect going forward. Charles often said, in the months that followed, that being a father and being king had never felt more like two separate jobs than they did that day. But he also came to believe that the distance between those two roles did not have to mean choosing one over the other permanently. It simply meant learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to hold both at once, without letting either one consume the other entirely. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you never miss what happens next.